After 1 year of no contact, Dad reached out to me but I slammed the door in his face. This infuriated Mom because she thinks I'm a spoilt brat who's giving Dad the cold treatment just because he passed on his business to my brother. So, I burst her bubble and show her this footage, and now their marriage is coming to an end. My dad is the worst loser in the history of parents. Ever since I was a kid, my dad had this grand vision of me and my older brother, Alex, stepping into his shoes and taking over his business one day. To him, his work wasn't just a job or a source of income. It was a legacy, something to be protected and passed down through the generations like a family heirloom. It was a source of pride, an extension of his identity, and he made sure that we understood that from a young age. Despite being the youngest, I felt an intense desire to follow in his footsteps, partly because I admired him and partly because he made it seem like this was the path we were destined to walk. Summers in our household weren't filled with lazy days at the pool or trips to amusement parks like they were for my friends. Instead, they were spent immersed in the world of my dad's business, whether it was interning, running errands, or handling small tasks. He found ways to involve us. Sometimes we'd even end up doing mundane jobs like sorting files, cleaning up inventory, or shadowing his meetings. He was determined to teach us everything he could. He believed in hands-on learning and that these experiences would prepare us for the future, instilling values like discipline and work ethic along the way. When my brother finally graduated from college, it felt like a monumental milestone for our family. We had all been eagerly anticipating his return to our hometown, where the next logical step, at least according to family expectations, would be for him to join my dad's business. It wasn't just a career path for him. It was practically an inheritance, a legacy that my dad had spent decades building and nurturing. Naturally, we assumed my brother would happily step into those shoes without question. But it turned out my brother had decided he didn't want to take over the family business after all. Instead, he announced that he had accepted a job in a city far away from us, working at some IT company. He would be moving there with his girlfriend, who also had found a job there. This news hit my parents hard. I remember the sheer disbelief on their faces, as if someone had just told them the sun wasn't going to rise the next day. My dad especially was beyond furious. He took my brother's decision as a personal affront, as if it were a betrayal of the highest order. Over the next few days he ranted incessantly. "He's not my son anymore," Dad shouted more than once to Mom while pacing around the room with clenched fists. To him, my brother's choice wasn't just about rejecting the business, it was about rejecting him, his values, and everything he had worked for. Mom, on the other hand, refused to believe my brother could make this decision all on his own, and instead placed the blame squarely on his girlfriend. According to her, it had to be his crazy girlfriend and her manipulative ideas which had pulled him away from the family. She painted my brother as some sort of a helpless victim of his girlfriend's plot, saying things like, "If it weren't for that girl, he would have come back to us." Anyway, my parents continued to pressure and guilt my brother to change his mind. As a result, after weeks of arguing with them, he decided to cut off all contact with us. Calls went unanswered, texts unacknowledged, and any attempt to reach out was met with silence. It was devastating for my parents, who oscillated between anger, grief, and denial. With my brother gone, suddenly all the weight of the family legacy was placed squarely on my shoulders. My dad, who had been so consumed by his anger and disappointment in my brother, seemed determined to make sure I wouldn't betray him in the same way. He tightened his grip on me, dictating every aspect of my life. I became his other son, as he would always put it, the one who would inherit his business and fulfill his dreams since my brother had failed. For context, I'm a girl. Yet in my dad's eyes he treated me like his son, which was very confusing. At first I didn't let his attitude bother me. I even found some pride in the fact that he believed in me in his own way. But over the years I began to see how warped and toxic his expectations were. His idea of grooming me to be the heir to his legacy involved stripping away any trace of femininity. He discouraged, no, outright forbade me from wearing anything pink. He insisted I keep my hair short, saying it made me look more like the son he wished I could be. I was not allowed to paint my nails or put on makeup. Looking back, I realize how deeply misogynistic his thinking was. He didn't see me as an individual or as his daughter. He saw me as a vessel to carry on his ambitions. When I finally graduated with a business degree, my parents were very proud. I had worked incredibly hard during college, and my efforts paid off when I landed a fantastic job all on my own merit. I thought maybe I could convince my parents to let me work at the job I had secured for a few years before helping with their business. But my dad, being as controlling as ever, refused to let me follow the career I had worked hard for. He insisted that I give it all up and join his business immediately. He argued that he didn't want me to work under anyone else except him. Reluctantly, I did as he asked. I left behind my dream job and stepped into the role he had envisioned for me. For years, I slaved away under his watchful eye. Working for my dad was an all-consuming commitment. My day started early with me logging hours of work, juggling client calls, and attending endless meetings. By the time I made it home at night, I was utterly drained only to repeat the cycle the next day. The workload wasn't just physically exhausting, it was mentally and emotionally draining too. My dad was a notorious workaholic and his expectations of me were sky high. And anything less than perfection was unacceptable. For 6 long years my personal life completely disappeared. I had no time for friends, no time for dating, and certainly no time for myself. My world revolved around the business and meeting my dad's demands. It wasn't just that I had no life outside of work, it was that I wasn't allowed to have one. To him, anything that distracted me from the business was a waste of time and he would forbid me from pursuing it. Then one evening, out of the blue, my brother Alex showed up on our doorstep. We hadn't seen him in years. Despite everything that had happened to him, I couldn't help but feel a surge of happiness to have him back. He was my brother after all, and part of me had missed him terribly. After settling down, Alex told us why he had been out of touch for so long. He started to apologize profusely to our parents, saying he had genuinely believed that leaving home to take up his IT job felt like the right decision for him at the time. But life hadn't worked out the way he'd planned. His company had downsized and he had been laid off. To make matters worse, his girlfriend, the one my mom had spent years blaming for his absence, had left him for someone else after he lost his job. With no job, no girlfriend, and nowhere else to turn, Alex had decided to come back home. Seeing his sorry state, my parents immediately forgave him. They were overjoyed to have their golden son back, conveniently brushing aside all the years of anger and disappointment. It was as if they had been waiting for this moment all along, ready to welcome him back with open arms the moment he returned. My dad kept telling Alex how happy he was to have his son back home and couldn't wait for him to join the business. When Alex finally started working with us, it became quickly clear that he had a lot to learn. My brother had no leadership qualities or any knowledge in business. He struggled to even explain our business properly to new clients. However, Dad encouraged him to continue making mistakes and learn, and I was the one tasked with bringing my brother up to speed. At my dad's insistence, Alex shadowed me day in day out. I became his mentor, teaching him everything my dad had drilled into me over the years, as well as the additional knowledge I had gained through my own hard-earned experience. It wasn't easy, but I did it anyway. Then just 4 months after my brother's return, my dad had a sudden heart attack. Thankfully, we managed to get him to the hospital in time and he survived, but the doctors firmly informed us that at his age he needed to cut down on stress, work less, and prioritize his health more. If he doesn't do this, then he won't live long. This was a terrifying wake-up call for all of us. Mom was very shaken up about losing Dad and begged him to finally take a step back from the business and focus on himself. Eventually, my dad agreed. He called a family meeting to announce that he would officially retire and hand over the reins of the business. At that moment, I felt a bit sad at the thought of no longer working side by side with my dad, but I was also excited to finally take over the business and help it reach new heights. After all those years of relentless hard work, pouring my heart and soul into the business, I believed this was my moment. I was ready to lead, to finally make my mark and carry on the legacy that had been drilled into me for years. But then my dad dropped a bombshell that shattered everything I had envisioned. He announced that my brother, Alex, would be the one to take over the business and not me. He continued to announce that I would continue working in my current position, helping my brother to run things smoothly. I was furious when I heard this. "Dad," I said, my voice shaking, "I've worked with you for years. I know the ins and outs of this business. I know all the clients I've built relationships with, the co-workers, and I have plans to expand the company. Alex has barely been here for 4 months. How can you possibly think he's ready to take your role? He can barely even talk to people, let alone order anyone around." But my dad dismissed my protest, saying that this is where I should step in and help out my brother in any way that I could. He continued to explain, "Alex is the man of the family. This business is now his responsibility, so don't worry. He's going to step up and take care of it." Those words felt like a slap in my face. It didn't matter that I was the one who had kept the business running alongside him. It didn't matter that I was the one who had secured so many clients over the years. All my sacrifices, all the years I spent proving myself, were suddenly irrelevant because of my gender. I was devastated, and, to make matters worse, Alex didn't even pretend to be conflicted about it. He accepted my dad's decision without hesitation, wearing a smug smile that made my blood boil. When I confronted him later, hoping for some semblance of understanding, he brushed me off. "You're the youngest," he said with a casual shrug. "Stop arguing with Dad. This was always going to be my responsibility." The sheer arrogance in his tone left me reeling. It wasn't just that my brother was taking over the business. It was that he seemed to revel in my disappointment. Here was someone who had abandoned the family and the business for years, who had only returned because he had no other options, and now he was being handed everything I had worked so hard for on a silver platter. It felt like my entire world had been turned upside down. Everything I had sacrificed, every dream I had nurtured, was taken from me in an instant, all because of a belief that I, as a woman, couldn't possibly shoulder the same responsibilities as a man. After that, I completely spiraled. For days I couldn't stop crying. The betrayal, the injustice of it all weighed on me like a crushing burden. I had spent years pouring every ounce of myself into the business, sacrificing my time, my relationships and my own dreams, only to be told that none of it mattered. I was just a woman, and in their eyes that meant I wasn't good enough. I was so pissed that I stopped going to work altogether. I couldn't bear to face my brother or my dad, pretending everything was fine when inside I felt like I was falling apart. I started drinking, not because I enjoyed it, but because it was the only way to numb the pain and feel something other than the relentless ache of betrayal. I sat alone in my apartment staring at the walls, wondering how things could have gone so wrong. To make matters worse, my parents didn't see my reaction as valid. They dismissed my pain as an overreaction, treating it as if I were being immature and unreasonable. "It's the right decision," they kept telling me. My dad even had the nerve to tell me that if I took over his business, clients might not feel comfortable with a woman running such a large and prestigious company. Ultimately, I reached a breaking point. I realized I couldn't stay in that environment any longer, constantly fighting for approval that would never come. If they thought my brother was the perfect candidate, then fine, they could have him. I was done trying to earn my dad's respect or live up to my parents' impossible standards. I made the decision to not only leave the business but also that town for good. When I handed in my resignation, my dad reacted exactly as I expected. He yelled at me, his face red with anger, accusing me of abandoning the family at a critical time in the business. He demanded to know how I could possibly walk away when my brother needed my help to transition into the role. My mom's reaction was equally harsh, if not worse. She treated me, saying that if I left, she and dad would never consider me as their daughter again. Her words cut deep, but by that point I was so exhausted, so utterly drained that even her threats couldn't stop me. I had spent too many years bending over backward to meet their expectations, and I finally realized it was time to live for myself. With all the money I had earned and saved over the years, I packed up my things and moved far away. I left behind the business, my parents, and the suffocating rules they had imposed on my life It's been almost a year now since I left my parents' business, and I can confidently say it's been the best decision I've ever made for myself. For the first time in what feels like forever, I wake up each day without the crushing weight of expectations, the fear of being criticized for every little mistake, or the suffocating need to constantly prove myself. There's no one hovering over me, lecturing me or forcing me to be someone I'm not. I've let my hair grow out and wear whatever I want without my dad's incessant comments about looking too girly. I've also started therapy slowly but surely. I'm working on healing the wounds left by years of emotional neglect and control. I've made friends, real friends, who support me and accept me for who I am. On top of that, I'm in a loving and fulfilling relationship with my boyfriend John. He's kind and understanding, and he's everything I could have hoped for. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm truly living. So when my dad called yesterday, I didn't even think about answering. Since the day I walked out, my parents have kept their word. They haven't contacted me. My brother occasionally sends me texts filled with guilt-tripping remarks about how difficult it is for him to handle the business alone, or how I've made my parents sad after abandoning them. But beyond that, there's been complete silence from their end. So when my dad's number popped up on my phone screen, I simply let it ring and ignored him. This morning I was jolted awake by the persistent ringing of my doorbell. Still groggy, I stumbled to the door, wondering who on earth could be visiting so early. When I opened it, I was stunned to find my dad standing there. Although it had only been a year since I last saw him, he looked different, older. His face seemed to sag with wrinkles I hadn't noticed before, and his skin hung loose, a stark reminder of time passing. I realized then that I had become so used to seeing him every day that I never noticed how much he had aged. For the first time, he didn't look intimidating to me. Just a tired older man. He wasted no time. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice firm. "I'm here because you didn't pick up my calls yesterday and this is urgent." Typical of him, always straight to the point. No pleasantries, no preamble. I hesitated but eventually stepped aside, allowing him in. We sat down and I waited, half expecting some grand apology or even just a simple, "How have you been?" But my hopes were quickly dashed. Dad dove straight into why he was there. He told me that he wanted me to come back home with him and join back the business. He continued to say how I had rebelled enough and he had just let me, but now it was time for me to be responsible and help out the family business. I glared at him in disbelief. After everything that had happened, after the way they had treated me, he had the audacity to show up at my doorstep asking me to go back with him? I took a deep breath, steadying myself before responding. "No," I said firmly, meeting his gaze. "I'm not coming back. This is not me rebelling against you. This is my life now and I like it. I don't care what happens to the family business." My dad blinked, caught off guard by my dismissive tone. I had never spoken to him this way before, but that was back when I was still an obedient, foolish child who wanted to please him. Since I had left home and found my own footing, I no longer cared about his opinion of me. My dad's tone shifted as he launched into a tirade about my brother, Alex. He admitted outright that my brother was incapable of running the business. He talked about how the company was nosediving because Alex lacked the people skills to build relationships with clients. His voice rose as he went on blaming Alex for being too much like our mom, gentle, introverted, and utterly lacking in the business-savvy attitude my dad claimed he and I possessed. I raised my eyebrows at this revelation, feeling a mixture of vindication and anger bubbling up inside me. "If that's the case," I said evenly, trying to keep my voice steady, "then why didn't you give me the business instead of him last year? You know I had worked harder. I had proven myself and I had been the one who actually knew how to handle everything." My dad's response was infuriatingly predictable. "I could never do that," he said firmly, his tone dismissive, like the answer should have been obvious to me all along. "Why not?" I pressed, though deep down I already knew what he was going to say. His answer came as a shrug accompanied by a nonchalant remark that pierced through me like a dagger. "Because you're a girl. What I have built means something, so I can't just leave it up to you." The words hung in the air are sharp and suffocating. "So just because I'm a woman you think I'm not allowed to run your business yet you have come here to ask for help?" My voice trembled with a mix of rage and disbelief. My dad rolled his eyes as if I were the one being unreasonable. He launched into a speech about how he had built the business from the ground up, pouring his blood, sweat and tears into it and how he had always dreamed of passing it down to a son. "But instead," he spat bitterly, "your mother gave me a nerdy, incapable son and a daughter." I stared at him in shock, struggling to process what he had just said. He continued, oblivious to the damage his words were causing. "I never wanted a daughter," he admitted bluntly, his eyes fixed on mine. "But watching you over the years changed my mind. You're more like me than Alex ever was. I'm proud of you for that." But he trailed off shaking his head. "Even with everything you've done, I could never die knowing that I let my business be run by a woman." As if this wasn't enough, my dad even shifted the blame entirely onto my mom, muttering bitterly about how he wished she had given birth to 2 sons instead of me. He looked so disappointed that it broke my heart to see my own father demeaning me this way as if I were a mistake, as if my very existence was something to regret. He sat there in my living room spewing the same old misogynistic garbage I had always heard and then had the nerve to try and smooth it over with money. "I can't give you the business," he said matter-of-factly, "but I'd be willing to offer you a very high salary to make up for everything. That's the best I can do." The audacity of this man, my father, to show up uninvited at my doorstep asking for my help after everything he'd said and done while still clinging to his archaic ideas about my gender, and blaming my mother for his perceived misfortune. I couldn't believe it. I took a deep breath, steadying myself and met his gaze. "You have repeatedly hurt me by demeaning me and my gender," I said slowly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I'm not your backup plan. I'm not going to fix the mess you created when you handed the business to Alex. You made that choice all on your own. If you regret it now, I don't care. You have to live with it. I don't know why you came to see me after all this time, but I'm done arguing with you. I want you to get out of my house." He looked at me in disbelief. I said, "Get out," I shouted again, my hand gesturing toward the open door, "before I lose my temper even more." However, he doubled down, his voice rising in indignation. "You're disrespecting me," he spat. "I'm your father, and as your parent I have every right to ask this of you. You owe it to us." "I don't owe you anything," I said firmly, my voice unwavering. "I already gave 6 years of my life to that pathetic business and it got me nowhere. Now I'm finally free. I have a job now. A real job that makes me happy. I'm done with your manipulation, your control and your toxic views on women. Also, you know what, Dad? Please don't ever say I'm just like you when you are just a selfish, bitter loser who cares more about his pride than his own children. I never want to be anything like you." Finally, I pointed to the door again. "Now get out of my house," I said coldly. I shut the door on his face as he continued to yell at me from outside. It was the first time I had ever stood up to my dad and my hands were trembling. I do feel a bit guilty, so AITA, for turning down my dad's offer to return to his business and for yelling at him. Update 1. First of all, for everyone asking how my parents know my address, of course they know where I live. While I moved away after my dad didn't give me the business, I didn't just completely cut them off. However, they had never disturbed me before. Now coming on to the update, after my dad left, My mom called me and started yelling at me for slamming the door in his face. She called me a disrespectful spoiled brat and accused me of giving my dad the cold shoulder just because he passed his business on to my brother. My brother also sent me a few nasty messages telling me I should get over myself and come back home before it's too late for the business. He thinks I'm stressing dad out unnecessarily by acting this way. None of them really understand me. Update 2. Thank you to everyone for your advice. It truly means a lot to me, and I'm grateful to anyone who has taken the time to comment on my post. Now for the update. I took everyone's advice and burst my mother's bubble by sending her a clip of what exactly my dad had told me the day he came to visit. I have cameras on my front door, back door, and in my living room for my own protection. So everything my dad said to me was recorded. I created a group chat with my mom, my brother and my dad, and I sent those clips there. I explained how this time my dad had not only repeatedly disrespected me just because I'm a woman but had also blamed mom for giving birth to me. I revealed how he wished he had 2 sons instead of 1. I also pointed out how he didn't even respect my brother's work simply because my brother was more like my mom and how much he hated him. I wanted mom and my brother, who supported my dad so blindly, to see the truth about him. I then left the group and blocked all of them. I felt a bit satisfied knowing that this was going to start a huge fight between them. Now my mom and brother could see exactly what my dad thought of them and there was nothing they could do to blame me for it. Update 3. It's been a month since my last update. After I sent those clips to my family, my mom left my dad. A few days ago, she sent me an email apologizing for everything. She explained that after watching the videos I had sent them and hearing how my dad spoke to me, had opened her eyes. She admitted that she had always tried to justify my dad's behavior, but after seeing the way he talked about me, her, and my brother, she felt repulsed by him. Apparently, ever since then, they had been fighting a lot, and when dad kept refusing to apologize to anyone, my mom decided to leave him for good. In the email, my mom also mentioned that my brother had cried after watching the video, especially hearing how dad had basically emasculated him.